The forms of disavowal we see in Tennyson, Bronte, Wells, and many other 19th century writers speak to a deeper set of contradictions in the rising secular humanist order, something that is maybe nowhere more clearly seen than in the writings of Wells's former professor, the man known as Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. I want to turn to him now because he shows how disavowal didn't just characterize the response to evolution, but it informed the way it was actually articulated by many of the century's leading scientists. Now, Huxley is actually a kind of surprising figure to tag with any form of disavowal, since he was maybe the century's most vocal foe of science denialism. He was notorious for his attacks on creationists, conservative members of the scientific establishment, who spread what he called willful and deliberate falsehoods about the overwhelming evidence for evolution. Huxley revels in what he calls the vanity and willful ignorance of those who argue that humans are somehow more than natural. In Man's Place in Nature, he writes that there is, quote, no absolute structural line of demarcation that can be drawn between the animals and ourselves. And I may add that the attempt to draw a psychical distinction is equally futile, and that even the highest faculties of feeling and of intellect begin to germinate in lower forms of life. I want to emphasize that what Huxley is articulating here is maybe the most radical implication of evolutionary thought, and it's the third rail that Darwin himself, for a while, was afraid to touch. The complete continuity of human beings and other animals. The full acceptance of our own species as embodied, material, natural, completely produced by, and enmeshed in the web of biological life. So this argument is not only ontological, it is ecological. Or we might say an array of ecological implications flows directly from that radical ontological shift. And yet, even as he's busy calling out the deniers, Huxley engages in his own form of denial in the very next breath. He goes on, at the same time, notice Menonese all the same. We have a little bit of an echo there. At the same time, no one is more convinced than I am of the vastness of the gulf between civilized man and the brutes, or is more certain than whether from them or not, he is assuredly not of them. This is a very strange moment, because Huxley seems to be saying two opposite things at once. There is no line of demarcation between humans and animals, and there is a vast gulf between them. How is a gulf not a form of demarcation? Or what to do with the idea that humans are from animals, but not of them? How can there be genealogy without affiliation? The emphasis, which again is in the original, makes it sound like something really precise is being offered. But that sound of precision works like a kind of white noise machine, muffles the deeper ambiguity and the impossible contradictions in what he's trying to say. Humans are animals, humans are not animals. Elsewhere, Huxley doesn't offer pretend precision, but strategic vagueness. He writes that humanity, quote, stands raised as on a mountaintop far above the level of his humble fellows, transfigured from his grosser nature by reflecting here and there a ray from the infinite source of truth. Here, he's helping himself to the language and imagery of the Bible in order to troll his religious-minded opponent. He isn't saying humans are transfigured in some supernatural sense. At the same time, he's also not saying that. Because the word can't help but carry exactly those kinds of associations. Huxley is winking at the reader, but he's not being merely parodic. He's, on some level, but without quite saying so, attempting to suggest some ground of qualitative difference between humans and non-human animals, even as he wants to take his opponents to task for holding on to exactly such beliefs. But I want to stress that Huxley's various equivocations aren't merely expressions of bad faith, and it's worth taking the measure of them to understand the role they play in his social and political vision. For Huxley, as for many other Victorians, the felt sense that the human might have a status beyond the merely animal might be a fiction, But that fiction is what underwrites a whole set of socially organizing principles, habits, norms, projects, institutions. If there is nothing anyone can do about, let's say, the inevitable extinction of the human species, then what's the point of dwelling on it? One might be an animal, but isn't it better for everyone, socially, morally, politically, spiritually, to believe that one is something higher? Even if we know that this something higher is just a fiction, but we all agree to behave as if it is real, doesn't it in some sense become true? In any case, aren't some things better ignored just in order to get on with the business of living? I would say that the climate crisis suggests that the answer to all of these questions is no. That, indeed, the wish to just get on with the business of living is itself part of the problem. That turning a blind eye to the natural world may seem a way of organizing human affairs, but is actually, to use Amitav Ghosh's term, deranging in both the short and long terms. And that extinction may not be a distant eventuality, but something we are bringing into being before our very eyes. Today, I think soft denial and disavowal seem to us mere forms of escapism, guiltily confessed to, almost reflexively turned into a joke. We're keenly aware of our evasions and rationalizations, including the fact that that is all they really are. For Huxley, as for many Victorians, disavowal seemed the only viable path between Scylla and Charybdis, between, on the one hand, a biblical cosmology that for him was all about the hard denial of reality, and on the other, a social Darwinism, which simply let the natural loose into human affairs and turned the social world over to the law of the jungle. So we can see, I think, something of the logic of Huxley's position, maybe even sympathize with the conundrum he was in, while also noting that this fiction of a still elevated man always comes, rhetorically and representationally, at the expense of the environment. In fact, the elevation of the former man seems to depend upon either the denigration or even erasure of the latter. This is maybe clearest in his discussion of human civilization and its place in nature. For Huxley, human civilization is, of course, fully natural. Like a beehive or a rabbit warren, it develops out of biological needs and capacities, shaped by, subject to access to resources, changes in climate, population pressures, all that kind of stuff. And all of that is just straight out of Darwin. At the same time, he says, civilization is also the only agency on Earth that can resist and even subdue nature. And this, I should note, is his terminology. Whatever the topic arises, Huxley almost always turns to the language of combat and warfare. Nature, he says, is antagonistic and hostile, and thus the goal of civilization is to subdue it, to influence, modify, and bend it to the human will. In later works, it gets even crazier. He mounts these really elaborate arguments on behalf of industrial growth, and he has accounts of coal combustion, where he argues that it's not only an inherently stable and orderly process to burn coal, it's totally clean. I mean, these are like advertisements for fossil fuel extraction that would make Chevron blush, you know? And they seem insane, coming from someone living in London at the time of Dickens. And it feels like somewhere along the line, soft denial has hardened into cement. And I want to stress how bizarre all of this is. Darwin's theory is all about the complex, reciprocally defining multi-scalar interconnections between organisms, environment, topography. His work is sensitive to the ways the smallest changes to an ecosystem can produce radically transformative, often unforeseen consequences. And these ideas are not incidental to the theory. They sort of are the theory. And yet, somehow, here we have Huxley, the 19th century's most vocal cheerleader for these ideas, using them and taking them in a few short steps to an argument for open warfare against nature. The stark opposition between civilization and nature is one Darwin had supposedly done away with. But the same logic of disavowal, this idea that civilization can somehow be from, but not of, nature, allows Huxley not only to redraw the line, but to fortify it. Now, of course, When Huxley is using the language of warfare, he is speaking the language of empire. And when he says civilization, he means Western civilization. And when he says man, he means European man. These two are fictions. These two are forms of denial in which an anthropologically inclusive category is made to function as a sociogenically exclusive signifier. This is what the cultural theorist Sylvia Wynter has described as the overrepresentation of man, the way the Western bourgeois pursues its own interest quote, as if it were the human itself. For Huxley, once again, this as if is made possible by the strategic ambiguities of voice. You will have noticed that when he posits his vast gulf between humans and other animals, he says it is between civilized man and the brutes. Now, in context, that civilized ostensibly means man who is by definition civilized as opposed to animals who are not. But we have to hear that this term also draws a distinction within the category of the human as well, a split between the European and the native other, civilized man and the brutes. The other side of the gulf, the word brutes, is what allows these radically opposed meanings to emerge, since brute technically means animal, but was commonly and colloquially used as a racial and class-based marker to refer to other human beings. You think of Colonel Kurtz, exterminate the brutes. Here again is the voice of disavowal, speaking opposites into being, simultaneously consolidating the universal category human, and in the very same moment, radically restricting it to one tiny, privileged subset. For Wynter, the idea of race functions as the non-supernatural, but no less extra-human grounds on which empire could rationalize its practices. This, then, is another way of understanding Huxley's use of the word transfigured. The idea of attaining any kind of divine significance has been done away with. But the possibility of still somehow becoming more human than human mysteriously resides in the logic of racial exclusion. That the very idea of more human than human is a contradiction in terms, and impossibility is, of course, where the work of disavowal happens. Yes, it makes no sense, but all the same. Thus, the human-animal divide on some level is the civilization-nature divide, which is the European-native divide, each fabrication making possible the others on which it also depends. Like Escher's two hands, each drawing the other into being, the system is impossible, all the same, there it is. The war Huxley would take up against nature is also a description of the imperial project, the civilizing drive, so to speak, which is bound up with a whole range of other forms of denial and disavowal that either identify native peoples with nature itself or erase them altogether. I'm thinking about what the anthropologist Johannes Fabian calls the denial of coevalness, the argument in evolutionary anthropology that native peoples do not belong to the now of modernity, and thus, in some sense, are not really here at all, or the related fiction of terra nullius, the idea that the territories coveted by empire are unpopulated, despite the fact that there are obviously people living there. We've seen how in Wells, in Tennyson, in Huxley, in the liberal humanist imaginary more broadly, a certain amount of denial seemed necessary to allow an ordered and humane social world to come into being. At least that was the idea. In the imperial territories, we see the terrifying flip side of that notion, a discursive denial that then makes itself real through campaigns of forced resettlement and genocide. Thus, does land that is empty become land that is empty? And fictions about territory are forcibly manufactured into facts on the ground. Frederick Neurath describes the steps of this process. First, deny something's existence. Second, take action so that the denial rings true. This takes the form of extermination or the assignment of identities without a future. Afterwards, denialism then becomes a question of forms of historical erasure, scrubbed memories, sanitized official reports, and national myths. We seem to have come quite a distance from Charlotte Bronte not wanting to read a book. But the point is that all of these phenomena were and are complexly interarticulated in their period and in ours. To face the reality of the human place in nature is to begin to think ecologically. But to face that reality means coming to terms with the way that category human is always itself constructed in racial terms. Understanding that construction, meanwhile, means reckoning with the history of empire and settler colonialism in all the horror of that history, which means recognizing with the rapacity of capitalism and extractivism, and the sources from which the very fantasies of insulation from the natural world are secretly constructed. Each one of these links in the chain might be aversive, hard to think about, identity-threatening in any number of ways. Each, therefore, is ripe for denialism, both as a matter of individual psychology and, more importantly, as an organized production of the culture at large. Last part. Darwin often wrote about his own tendency to disavow his own work, finding it difficult not to sometimes purposefully forget what he knew better than almost anyone about the human place in the natural world. He puts it most succinctly in The Origin of Species itself. Nothing is easier to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than to constantly bear this conclusion in mind. The language of admission is the happier twin of the language of denial, but the questions raised are the same. How much one is willing to take on board? How can one learn to live with what one knows? In 1974, the naturalist Annie Dillard echoes this line of Darwin's in her masterpiece, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Evolution loves death more than it loves you or me. This is easy to write, easy to read, and hard to believe. It's striking to me that here we are, almost 120 years after Darwin's book first appeared, we find Dillard still trying to wrap her head around the idea. It's incredible that maybe the most important American nature writer since Henry David Thoreau has to admit to still being in some amount of denial about the natural world. In many ways, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is a 300-page dramatization of just how difficult it is for her to know what she already knows. In a speech near the end of her life, Rachel Carson connects some of the plot points in the story I've been tracing here today, linking the disavowal of Darwin with contemporary, to her and to us, forms of environmental crisis and breakdown. The toxic effects of pesticides and other industrial chemicals are well known, she says, and yet somehow they continue to be pumped heedlessly into the air, water, and soil. For Carson, this has everything to do with an illusory sense of human difference, which itself is born out of the failure to fully reckon with Darwin. She says, quote, today it would be hard to find any person of education who would deny the facts of evolution. Yet, so many of us deny the obvious corollary, that man is affected by the same environmental influences that control the lives of all the many thousands of other species to which he is related by evolutionary ties. Carson's point is Dillard's. We have never been Darwinian. And both the cause and effect of this is the failure to come to terms with the natural environment and our place within it. But this, I want to emphasize, is not a failure of imagination or nerve. Both of these writers were replete with both, but instead it's the result of an ongoing social production of denial, hard, soft, and in between, a phenomenon that has deep roots in the history of racial ideology and empire, and that has helped both produce and obscure, has produced, by obscuring, the profound environmental crises we face and avoid facing today. In a way, the climate crisis is simply the most conclusive and dramatic demonstration of many of Darwin's arguments. If humanity can destroy its own habitat to the point of bringing its own extinction into view, and it can do so in large part knowingly, then one has to wonder about the vaunted moral sense and rationality upon which the sense of superiority to its non-human brethren was founded in the first place. Darwin may have conceptually decentered humanity from the story of life on Earth, but climate change, in a sense, makes that decentering newly vivid, palpable, even immediate. Our own chapter in the history of life on Earth isn't simply finite and rather incidental in the grand scheme of things. It actually seems to be coming to a rather ignominious close before our eyes, written daily on dying reefs and dissolving glaciers and flooded cities and blackened forests. Climate denial today resembles the denial of evolution in the 19th century. In its hard variety, it generates false doubts, weaponizes skepticism, traffics in pleasing forms of make-believe. In its softer forms, it finds creative ways to manage knowledge, to push things out of mind, to live as though it were not so. But these two moments of science denialism don't just share parallel features, they are genealogically related. They are part of the same long, continuous story of avoidance and fantasy, one that is structured according to a combative, instrumentalist view of the natural world, driven by the demands of capital and empire, and underwritten by the dehumanizing logic of racial hierarchies. The task, it seems to me, is to recognize how deeply and historically interwoven these phenomena are, if there is to be any hope of addressing the various environmental, human, and social emergencies we must face. Thank you.